Thank you all for joining us today for the Phosphorus Management Workshop. Today we will be talking about how to manage phosphorus in conservation cropping systems. My name is Chris Reynolds and I am the Midwest Regional Director for American Farmland Trust. First off, I'd like to thank the Mosaic Company and the Walton Family Foundation for making this webinar possible. We have been working with them in Illinois for several years to help increase the adoption of conservation practices on the land and to help decrease the potential for nutrient losses. Next slide, please. This webinar is also possible because of the cooperation between several partners. The Illinois Sustainable Ag Partnership focuses on messaging, training, outreach, and education for farmers and their trusted advisors to bring together and disseminate new information and lessons learned in plain, practical language. The Upper Macoupin Creek Watershed Partnership is an initiative with over 15 federal, state, and local government partners, ag trade associations, environmental groups, ag retailers, and a local university. AFT is the only national agriculture organization that approaches its work in this comprehensive, holistic manner. We also recognize the power of combining on-the-ground projects with objective research and effective advocacy. I want to give a special thanks to the Midwest team for their efforts in organizing today's webinar. Emily, Teresa, April, Jean, and Sarah, thanks for all that you do day in and day out to help protect ag land, increase conservation practice adoption, and keep farmers on the land. Next slide. Before we begin, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. Please use the chat function for any audio and technical issues that you may be experiencing. The Q&A function can be utilized throughout the webinar for questions for the presenters. After the presentations, we will have time for the presenters to answer questions during the panel discussion. We'll be recording today's webinar to share with others that were unable to attend the live event. CCA CEUs are available for today's webinar. If you have the CCA app, you can scan the code that will be on the screen at the end of today's webinar. If you don't have that app, but you would like to receive credits, please place your name and CCA number in the chat box and we'll make sure that we submit that information. If you are watching the recording, please know that the self-study CEUs are also available. At this time, I'd like to ask Jean to share the results of our entry poll. So it looks like we have a nice mix of from across all sectors joining us today. Thank you all for, again, thank you all for joining us. Next slide, please. In 2015, in response to the Gulf of Hypoxia Task Force, Illinois released their nutrient loss reduction strategy. This strategy identified practices that could be voluntarily adopted by farmers and landowners to decrease non-point source nutrient losses from cropland. Since that time, American Farmland Trust has been promoting the use of these in-field management practices as part of a soil health management or conservation cropping system to not only improve the quality of soil, but to also improve water quality. The strategy also identified priority watersheds with the highest non-point source nutrient losses. The Upper Macoupin Creek was identified as one of these watersheds due to its high non-point source phosphorus loss. American Farmland Trust has been working alongside partners and agency staff in the watershed to provide additional technical and financial resources to farmers and landowners. We utilize tools that help us identify critical conservation areas in the watershed where in-field management practices will have the greatest potential for phosphorus reductions. The 4 R's and nutrient management should be the backbone of any conservation plan. And when coupled with practices like strip till, no-till, and cover crops, it will provide the greatest potential for phosphorus loss reductions. Next slide, please. At this time, I'd like to introduce our presenters for today's webinar. Dr. Heidi Peterson is with the Sand County Foundation and will be discussing the 4 R's of nutrient management stewardship. Dr. Fabian Fernandez with the University of Minnesota will be presenting on the phosphorus application and placement. Some of you may remember Dr. Fernandez from his time here in Illinois at the U of I. Dr. Nathan Nelson is with Kansas State University and will be closing things out today with a presentation on his research with cover crops and phosphorus runoff. It is at this time, it's my pleasure to turn the screen over to Dr. Heidi Peterson.
Good morning, everybody. Let me just share my screen here. All right, so I think everybody should see my screen and hear what I'm saying. If there's any problems, let me know right away. Let me just get rid of this. Okay, so thank you so much for the opportunity to discuss for our phosphorus management. As Chris said, I am with the Sand County Foundation. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with Sand County Foundation, we're a small national nonprofit, conservation-based out of Madison, Wisconsin. And we inspire and enable private landowners to ethically manage the natural resources in their care. I personally work out of Stillwater, Minnesota. And because over 60% of the land in the United States is privately owned, with 70% of that in agricultural use, we believe private landowners hold the key to environmental improvement. In the next 30 years, the global population is expected to increase by 2 billion people. Depending on how you set the consumption projections to meet the growing demand for food, fiber, and feed, the world's population needs to increase between 25 and 70% by 2050. Even though US farmland has decreased, our productivity has increased due to advances in ag mechanization and fertilizer use. However, even with our increased efficiency, our water quality continues to be degraded. In fact, 46% of the United States river and stream miles are in poor biological condition, with nitrogen and phosphorus as the most widespread chemical stressors. Ag inputs are the largest phosphorus sources to the Mississippi Atchafalaya River Basin. And 49% of that comes from fertilizer and manure. But that being said, it's important to point out that this region does produce over 40% of the corn grown in the world. So it is dominated by ag production and critical to meeting our global needs. I include these background slides because Illinois contributes 11% of the phosphorus that ends up in the Gulf of Mexico, which is greater than the volume of water that the Illinois River contributes. You already saw this graphic on one of Chris's slides, but according to the data from the Illinois Nutrient Loss Reduction Strategy, the Macoupin watershed is one of the top 3 watersheds in Illinois yielding the greatest amount of phosphorus each year. The use of fertilizers is critical for meeting our growing food supply. Phosphorus is the key to life. It's a component of every living plant and animal cell and a vital element for metabolic processes. In plants, phosphorus improves flower formation and seed production, increases stalk and stem strength, and stimulates root development. In addition, aiding plant growth and development, phosphorus fertilization can increase flavonoids and other antioxidants in fruits and vegetables, and it improves water use and speeds up the plant maturity. Phosphorus is taken up by crops primarily as orthophosphate. The major phosphorus fertilizers are designed to be highly soluble. Once it's dissolved, the phosphorus and orthophosphate fertilizers, such as MAP and DAP, is available for plant uptake. However, phosphorus chemistry in soils is complex. So for example, if we look at the pH, although soil pH doesn't affect phosphorus availability directly, it does indicate how certain minerals, iron, aluminum, calcium, interact with phosphorus in the soil. So in acidic soils, iron and aluminum concentrations are high, resulting in high phosphorus fixation. And the same is true in alkaline soils where there's a pH greater than 7 because soluble calcium is abundant. Phosphorus in the soil is a good thing for plants. However, too much of a good thing can be bad. And eutrophication, it's the natural aging of lakes or streams by nutrient enrichment. And although it is natural, increased additions of nutrients can accelerate this process. In the same way that nitrogen and phosphorus fertilize crops, they can also fertilize plants in the aquatic systems. In the spring, when there's an influx of nutrients, this initiates biological processes that can lead to the depletion of oxygen. So conservation practices can help minimize the phosphorus runoff from fields, but why not start at the source? And that's exactly what I'm going to be talking about today. A great place to begin is the discussion discussion is with 4R Nutrient Stewardship, which is actively considering all management practices and site-specific characteristics when making the right nutrient management decisions. This is where nutrient management planning comes into play and why it's so critical that certified crop advisors, retailers, and other ag or conservation professionals discuss farm management as a system rather than only nutrient application. To increase nutrient use efficiency and reduce the risk for losses, the fertilizer industry has led the 4R Nutrient Stewardship Initiative, which promotes the right source of fertilizer at the right rate for crop needs, the right time to match crop uptake, and in the right place so crops can utilize it. As we are determining the right source, rate, or time, and also the place, we also have to be considering the other 3 R's together with the R that we're focusing on. So making this decision without proper information for your specific field conditions can lead to costly mistakes. So it's really important to take the time to understand the core scientific and economic principles that interact. The scientific principles for the right source include supplying the nutrients in a plant available form, suiting the soil physical and chemical properties, recognizing the synergisms among nutrient elements and sources, and lastly, identifying the benefits and sensitivities to the associated elements. The right rate will vary year to year as farm management affects our soil resources. The right phosphorus rate might be higher than crop removal if soil test levels are low compared to when soil test levels are near optimum. Likewise, changing a cropping system can result in a previously right rate for a specific crop needing to be modified. So some nutrients in excess can result in an antagonistic relationship with another nutrient, and that interferes with its uptake and availability and reduces its use efficiency. So if one essential element is low, it prevents plants from reaching their potential. And nitrogen and phosphorus for sure have that relationship. So appropriate fertilizer applications help to overcome these limitations. Additionally, there may be positive relationships as well. For example, as phosphorus concentrations increase, the need for magnesium increases, and this relationship with phosphorus occurs when magnesium concentrations increase as well. I had a question once as somebody was budgeting their fertilizer, and they said, well, I heard that potassium is really important, so should I cut back on my phosphorus in order to supply with my financial budget more potassium? And in the end, it all just has to be balanced. You don't want to deprive your body of a nutrient, and it's the same as your soil. When determining the right rate for fertilizer, it's important to consider all nutrient sources available to the plant. Animal manure is a common source of plant nutrients, especially within Illinois. And if you're already applying manure, that phosphorus should be credited through the use of a manure test. That amount of phosphorus will vary based on the animal, how the manure is stored, and its moisture content. And it really comes down to what are you feeding your livestock. So the amount of the residual nutrients from a crop can also vary according to the type and environmental conditions. So this is really important to consider in a discussion with your client or your consultant. And looking at the data for Illinois from the Fertilizer Institute and IPNI, it appears that the amount of phosphorus fertilizer applied has been in balance on average when you look at the state with the amount of phosphorus removed from through harvested crops. So this is where the third and fourth R's, or timing and placement, are critical to reducing those losses. Nutrients should be applied to match the timing of plant uptake, which depends on the planting date, plant growth characteristics, sensitivity to deficiencies at particular growth stages, the local weather and climate. Mineralization of soil organic matter may supply a large quantity of some nutrients, but if the crop's uptake needs do not coincide with mineralization, deficiencies may limit the production. In Illinois, the potential for nutrient losses can be an important timing consideration. So avoiding application before precipitation events or on frozen soils, and when snowmelt is a potential for sure. These are the times when we see the highest losses. Timing is certainly becoming more challenging across Illinois because of the increase in frequency of large spring precipitation events, but it's really important to include that in our application. So all of the necessary field operations have to be considered to avoid planting delays. And I understand it's definitely a balancing act, but what it comes down to is that you don't want to lose all of your applied fertilizer and the money and the time that went into applying it to erosion and runoff losses. And based on the USGS data from the Macoupin Creek, it looks like the losses are primarily in the fall when the crops are harvested and in early spring when the fields are still bare and snowmelt begins to occur. The core scientific principles that define the right place for specific nutrient application include consideration of where plant roots are growing. Nutrients need to be placed where they can be taken up by growing roots when needed. And if you look at the graphic below, you see different species of plants have different root growth patterns affecting their individual abilities to access nutrients in various places in the soil. It's important to understand the soil chemical reactions that may lead to fixation, concentrating nutrients that are not as mobile, so phosphorus, in bands can improve the availability. And adjust placement based on the tillage system. Subsurface placement techniques that maintain crop residue cover on the soil can help minimize surface disturbance, reduce runoff losses, and conserve soil moisture. Lastly, it's really important to assess the differences within and among fields and crop productivity, soil nutrient supply capacity, and the vulnerability to nutrient loss. So in order for phosphorus fertilizer to be most effective, it needs to be usable by the plant. So usability is increased by placement close to the seed row and protection from fixation losses. Two primary options for applying nutrients on or in the soil in Illinois are broadcasting or banding them, or a combination of the two. Broadcast tends to be the most common in Illinois. So if you're broadcasting, I really urge you to adopt some form of management or light incorporation that increases your soil fertilizer contact. This will help to reduce this will help reduce your leaching or runoff losses. And if it's left on the top of frozen soil or surface applied right before a storm, it will not have the opportunity to make that contact with the soil. Now, when banding, the bands themselves can vary in the width and the position relative to the crop rows. The soils can be mixed then with tillage, organisms, some of the physical processes from variations in soil moisture or temperature. Banding, or if we're using manure, would be injecting, are options for subsurface applications. Bands placed near the seed at the time of planting are often referred to as starter bands, and they can be placed in direct contact with the seed trench, which is often called the pop-up, or to the side or below, or if it's to the side and below, that's what we call side banding. Multiple bands can be applied at various distances between the rows and also at different depths. Deep banding is not as common in Illinois. However, as we look at strip till systems, that's where we may see that. And so Dr. Fernandez may be discussing that a little bit more. As a quick example of how placement can reduce phosphorus losses, this graph from an Illinois study shows that injecting swine manure and chisel plowing inorganic triple superphosphate fertilizer on the contour was not only effective in reducing phosphorus losses, but also increased the time to runoff and decrease the runoff volumes. Now that we've gone through the 4 R's, I want to provide some background on why nutrient management should be planned using a systems approach. To do that, I want to make sure that we are all clear on what the critical value is. And the critical value is the soil test level where recommended nutrient rates generally drop to 0 in sufficiency approaches or to a crop removal level in a build maintenance approach. By using IPNI soil test database, which includes data from 60 soil test labs, I was able to examine how soil test phosphorus levels have changed across Illinois. Illinois actually has 3 regions with different critical levels for phosphorus. 20 is an average, and in the Macoupin Creek area, it falls within the region of the state characterized as high phosphorus and medium phosphorus supplying soils, meaning that they see a yield response from phosphorus fertilizer at a lower soil test phosphorus critical level. A majority of the samples submitted in Illinois are reported above the maintenance range, and this graphic indicates that it's about 63%, which is in line with the survey by Dr. Fernandez conducted in 2012. So this means that most soils are testing at levels where either no phosphorus fertilizer is required, or at most a small amount of starter supplying less than the crop removal would be sufficient. And calling out the number reported at greater than 50 parts per million, although that number is decreasing, it stresses the importance of soil sampling. Those farmers are overspending on their phosphorus. So we know why we want soil test phosphorus at the optimal level for farming, but why do we care about soil test phosphorus from an environmental standpoint? Or how does this tie back into the losses into Macoupin Creek and ultimately the Mississippi River? The loss of dissolved phosphorus and surface runoff is highly dependent on the phosphorus content of the surface soil. As illustrated on the graph on the screen, it was taken from a study completed in South Central Pennsylvania. The dissolved phosphorus concentration in surface runoff is on the y-axis, and soil test phosphorus depicted on the bottom, or the x-axis. So typically as soil test phosphorus increases, the concentration of the dissolved phosphorus in runoff increases. The same relationship exists for concentrations of phosphorus in subsurface flow. The Illinois Nutrient Reduction Strategy estimated that reducing average soil test phosphorus values to 20 parts per million of total phosphorus and following the 4 Rs could potentially reduce dissolved phosphorus in runoff by 3.2 million pounds per year. And that's equivalent to 266 large elephants flowing out of Illinois each year. When we look at a pay-for-performance structure that other states are initiating between municipal and rural stakeholders, this could equate to $160 million where phosphorus is trading for $50 per pound. Since the Midwest is experiencing increases in extreme precipitation events, placement and timing is becoming even more important. I mentioned earlier that efficiency and productivity has increased. However, if manure and inorganic fertilizers are applied in a way that they can just be washed from the field, that is reducing efficiency and increasing your economic loss. So phosphorus application method and timing relative to the rainfall influences the concentration of phosphorus in runoff and leachate. Several studies have been able to document a decrease in phosphorus loss with that increase in the length of time between application and precipitation. As a way to build more resiliency, we have been hearing more on adopting soil health practices. 2 management options will be discussed by Dr. Nelson and Dr. Fernandez today. As we do so, we must integrate adaptive phosphorus management, focusing on the 4 Rs to optimize recovery and minimize losses. I point this out because if we look at the soil factors that affect phosphorus availability, many are also impacted by soil health improvements. And therefore, we need to be considering how the integration of new management practices influence the rate, timing, and placement of phosphorus. With that, I leave you with 2 final thoughts. First, although there are not many conservation practices that specifically tackle dissolved phosphorus losses, implementation of site-specific 4R practices can reduce dissolved phosphorus losses and increase the availability for crop utilization. Second, please encourage discussions on the agronomic benefits of 4R nutrient stewardship. With that, thank you for your time today.
Thank you, Dr. Peterson. And I just encourage everybody, if they have any questions, please enter those in the Q&A box down below. At this time, I'll turn it over to Dr. Fernandez.
All right, very good. It's good to be here, even though I'm not in Illinois, but to kind of be in Illinois in a way. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about this project. I conducted in Illinois. Actually, it continued after I left Illinois for a few more years, and I'm excited to share with you some of the results from that project. This is a fairly large project. Actually, it was done over 3 farmer fields, and then we also had a kind of companion study at the South Farm of the University of Illinois with slightly different treatments, but some similar questions that we were trying to look at. And these are some of the questions that we were trying to research. Can we get by with less fertilizer when we ban the fertilizer compared to a broadcast application? Is application have something to do with availability? And so we were looking very intensively at roots and where the water was in relationship to the row and with depth in the soil. And the other component to this, which is what I will be discussing today, is are there environmental benefits with subsurface banding? And then another one that it was very important, but I will not really discuss today, is how to take soil samples when you ban the fertilizer. So again, a fairly large project today. I'm just going to be focusing only in one small aspect, but I'll be happy to share with you or talk with you later about some of the other results. Now, the environmental part of this was done in Douglas County. Douglas County, as you can see in the picture, is very flat. I think it's one of the flattest or the flattest county in the US. It has basically an average of less than 2% slope across the entire county. But, and we tend to think that when we have such flat land, we will have no runoff issues, and that's not the case. I was in Illinois when we had some really wet years, and you could see these in many fields that were very flat, where you know, soil moved and residue, crop residue moved with the water to the lower parts of the field or to the end of the field. And so with that, we decided to start this study looking at strip till. We had comparisons of a strip till and no till with different placements. And that's basically what I will be talking about today. This is very quickly the average 8-year average. So this is 8 years of data over 3 different farm fields. And we have the corn yield right here. We had 3 tillage placement systems, the no-till broadcast in blue, strip till broadcast in red. So basically we did the strip till, but we still broadcast the fertilizer over the top. And then we had strip till deep band, where we banded the fertilizer 6 inches below the surface with the strip till machine. And the first thing you see here is that the strip till yields were superior to the no-till broadcast. And so the tillage had a significant impact in the yield, but in terms of the placement, the difference between the red and the green here is the placement, broadcast versus deep band. There was statistically no difference in the yield. And we saw the exact same thing very consistently through all the years. So this is average across all of those years and sites. We also saw similar results when we were looking at soybean yields. One of the things that we did in the study is these were farmer fields, so they were long fields, but we selected areas within the field to take soil samples and see how phosphorus and potassium, but today I'll talk about phosphorus, changed over time and in relationship to the placement and the row and things like that. So we selected a 10 by 10 foot area in the field, and we collected a sample at the row position, 7.5, 15, and 22.5 inches away from the row, and kept those samples separate. We repeated that for several times, so that we ended up with a large composite for each of these 10 by 10 foot areas. And then we looked at the changes in fertility over time. So what you're looking at in here is, there is a lot of information here, so I'll kind of walk you through it. On the top, you see the no-till broadcast application. The middle graphs represent the strip-till broadcast, and then the bottom is the strip-till deep band. Over the top, you can see in row on the left-hand side, 7.5, 15, and 22.5 inches away from the row. And then we have 3 different depths, 0 to 4, 4 to 8, and 8 to 12 inches. And then in the x-axis, the horizontal axis, you see these numbers. This is the change in soil phosphorus over time. So over the study time that we have, 8 years. And so negative numbers mean that the fertility over time declined. Positive number means that it increased. So what we are looking at in here is, for all of these, is the check where we apply no phosphorus for all of these years. And what you see here is that for the top 2 sets of graphs for the broadcast applications, and even for the strip till where we apply no phosphorus, basically the surface layer got reduced. So there was a reduction in phosphorus in the surface. We were not applying any phosphorus, but obviously removing a crop and removing phosphorus. So that's kind of what you would expect. The fertility started to go down, more so in that top 4 inches than deeper in the soil profile. And then we look at one of the other rates that we had in there, which is about a maintenance rate. This was applied every other year. We were in a corn soybean rotation, and so we were applying this amount of 115 pounds P2O5 per acre every other year. And what you see here is that for the top 2 sets of graphs where we have the broadcast application, there was basically no change in the fertility. They were staying very close to 0, regardless of the position with respect to the row. And that's kind of what you would expect. We were basically applying as much phosphorus as we were removing. So over time, there was very little change, maybe a slight increase. And then the other thing that was very interesting is that with the strip till deep band, we see a substantial increase in the fertility at the point of application. So right in the in-row position, at the 4 to 8 inch, we were applying phosphorus at 6 inches. So huge increase in fertility there. But then you look at the between row positions, 7.5, 15, and 22.5 inches away from the row, and we see basically the same thing that we saw with the check plot, where we are reducing the fertility or the phosphorus availability in that layer, because the plants, even though we are applying it in a band, the plants continue to take phosphorus from that surface layer across all of the different positions with respect to the row. And then we go to the highest rate that we had. So this will be considered a build-up rate. And now we see that with the broadcast application, so the top 2 sets of graphs, we increase the fertility in the surface layer, regardless of the position with respect to the row. But with the strip till deep band, we continue to see the same pattern where there is a substantial increase at the point of application in the row, and we are actually seeing some phosphorus starting to move down because it's such a high concentration, it starts to move down. But in the rest of the field, so in the rows where we were applying no phosphorus, we see this constant decline in the fertility, just like we saw with the check plot. So with this scenario in mind, after all of these years having these changes in fertility and the distribution of phosphorus due to these treatments, we had kind of a perfect scenario here to evaluate the potential for runoff of phosphorus when we have these treatments in place for a number of years. And that's what we did. We conducted a rain simulation study. We installed these rain simulators in the field, and it was quite a challenge. You can see that those can become huge kites in the windy Midwest. And so, but we were able to basically install these rain simulators and collect the runoff water into buckets that we install in each one of these plots, as you can see in these images. And then we collected that water and analyzed it for phosphorus. So here are the results. There's a lot of data in here. I will talk about the significant results that we found in here. First of all, we found for the single components, tillage placement and phosphorus, a significant effect here in the load. And then the way that you can describe these, and these ladders basically represents if they are the same ladder, it means that they are not statistically different. And if in this case, strip till deep band was significantly lower than the two broadcast treatments. So that was for the tillage. And so in terms of load, the strip till deep band really reduced the load by 70% compared to the average of these two broadcast treatments. So a huge decrease in the loading. But then when we look at the phosphorus rate, we see that across all the rates, when you're at the check or around the optimum, basically this will be a maintenance rate, and these fields had adequate fertility to start with. So that's kind of what you would be targeting. We see no difference in the amount of loading that happened, but we do see a substantial increase in the loading once you apply more than is agronomically needed for that crop. And so this shows that agronomically and economically, the best thing to do is to apply rates where it will be adequate for the crop, but no over applying that basically reduces the return on the investment, and it also creates this potential for greater phosphorus loading. And then there are these three here with dissolved reactive phosphorus concentrations, total phosphorus, and soil Bray 1 that was a significant two-way interaction of the tillage placement by phosphorus rate. And we'll discuss those in the following slides. The Bray P1 phosphorus that you're looking at in here is in parts per million, but it's only for the top 1 inch of the soil. We were very interested in that top inch because that's where we have the phosphorus that is susceptible to runoff. So moving on and looking at those two-way interactions, trying to dissect them a little bit better. What you see here is the dissolved reactive phosphorus in parts per million. Again, the three tillage systems in the different colors, blue, red, and green. And then the three phosphorus rates that we were looking at. When you look at these sets of ladders, can be a little complicated to understand them, but basically what you are looking at is within each color, you're looking at the capital ladder. So C, B, A, it means that as we increase rate from 0 to 161 pounds, we see a substantial increase in dissolved reactive phosphorus leaching or running off for that particular treatment of a strip till broadcast. And so when you look at these statistics, you see that as we increase rates for the broadcast treatment, so the blue and the red bars, we increase the amount of dissolved reactive phosphorus. Whereas with the strip till deep band, the green one, you can see that these are all A's for the green bars. Capital A's, meaning that there was no difference in the amount of dissolved reactive phosphorus with the deep band placement. And then when you look at within each rate, so now you're comparing across the tillage system, so the lowercase ladders shows that, well, obviously here we apply no phosphorus, there were no statistical differences between the three tillage systems. But then as we start applying phosphorus, you can see this decline. Similar concentrations with the broadcast treatments and much lower concentrations with the deep band application. And then when we go to a very high rate of phosphorus, so a build-up rate, again, we continue to see fairly high concentrations with the broadcast treatments, very low concentrations with the strip till deep band. So again, showing that there is that benefit with the strip till deep band of reducing the dissolved reactive phosphorus. Now here we are looking at total phosphorus, again in concentrations, parts per million, and it's basically the same story as with DRP, with the dissolved reactive phosphorus, where Regardless of the phosphorus rate, we see no increase in total phosphorus when we deep band the fertilizer. But for the broadcast treatments, as we increase the amount of phosphorus that we apply, we start to increase the amount of total phosphorus loading. And so then we move to the third component, where we start a two-way interaction of tillage by phosphorus rate, tillage placement by phosphorus rate. And this is a similar story to the other two. It's slightly different in the sense that here we see that regardless of the tillage placement, we do see an increase in soil Bray 1 phosphorus in that surface layer. And again, remember that we are looking just at the top inch of the soil. This is not an agronomic sample that we normally take for 7-inch deep samples. This is just the top inch. And so you see that even with the strip till deep band, as we increase the phosphorus, we increase the amount of soil phosphorus. But still, when we look within those sets of bars, for each one of the rates, we see that the strip till deep band continue to have the lowest concentrations relative to the broadcast treatments. So a very consistent, regardless of what angle you take in looking at phosphorus, we see that very consistent. There is that benefit of reducing the potential for runoff when you have deep band application. And so this is kind of looking now at that earlier slide I showed you in terms of the change. We were looking at positive or negative numbers. This slide here shows those three rates again: phosphorus at check plot, a maintenance, and a high phosphorus rate. And here we are looking at the concentrations in the soil for the top 4 inches of the soil. So this is a little bit deeper sample, 4 inches. But you see from 2007 to 2015, when we had the study, you can see that when we apply no phosphorus in the left graph, the concentrations started to decline regardless of the tillage placement method. When we had a maintenance for the red and the blue, which will be the broadcast treatments, we see that the fertility was maintained or slightly increased, which is kind of what you would expect with a maintenance rate based on the recommendations. But for the strip till deep band, the green line that does a regression across all those dots for each of the years, you see maybe a slight decrease or about maintenance. And then when you go to a build-up rate, the far right graph, it shows that for both broadcast treatments, we see a huge increase in the phosphorus soil test values. And for the strip till deep band, we see basically a maintenance. These values were basically the average of all those positions with respect to the row. So we, as I mentioned, we collect the samples in the row and then at 3 different positions between the row multiple times. So that's combining all of those samples into a composite. So we are looking at the fertility of the whole field, not just a specific point in place. And then agronomically, we were looking at the top 8 inches of the soil. This is after 8 years. Again, we took these samples at the end of the study in 2015. And what you can see here is that for the 3 tillage placement systems across the top, and then the phosphorus rates, 0, 52, and 92, and this would be, sorry, these numbers I changed, they're basically 0, 92, and 161 for the every other year application. This would be considered for yearly applications. You see that across these tillage placement systems, for each rate, those values are fairly similar. You know, for the check, we are in the about 20, low 20s. For the maintenance in the 30s, and then for the higher rate in the 50 to 60. And so even though we may have a change in where that phosphorus is located in relationship to the row or in relationship to the surface or subsurface, you see that the fertility as a whole it's pretty much maintained similar across these tillage placement systems. So we are not really increasing or reducing the fertility just because of how we place the fertilizer. But we do have, as I mentioned earlier, a substantial difference in terms of the potential for runoff, which is extremely important. So agronomically, where we apply the fertilizer may make very little difference, but environmentally, it can have a substantial impact. And then finally, the last data slide is here showing at 2 different phosphorus values, the dissolved reactive phosphorus on the top and the total phosphorus on the bottom. The left-hand side graphs represent the phosphorus that we collected in the runoff in the fall. And then the ones on the right represent the same values, but in the spring. Again, you see all those little capital letters and lowercase letters to represent the statistical difference for the different tillage systems and phosphorus rates. The key point that I want you to get out of this slide is that in the fall, when you broadcast a phosphorus fertilizer, the potential for loss, either DRP or TP, total P, is substantial compared to the deep band. In the deep band, basically we had very little runoff, whereas in the broadcast we had a substantial runoff with the broadcast applications as we added phosphorus. But then when we fast forward and go to the spring, you see that these are all A's across all of these. So there was no difference whatsoever due to the tillage placement or the phosphorus rate. And so basically what we are seeing here is that in terms of when to apply phosphorus to reduce the potential for runoff, the fall would be a better time because you have less potential for runoff in the fall typically. I mean, it's drier. Also, the soil has more capacity to absorb water, whereas in the spring we are normally saturated. And when you look at the precipitation pattern, we see that springs tend to be wetter than the fall. And so the fall is a better time than the spring application in terms of phosphorus. But the other part too is that if you're going to apply phosphorus in the fall, when it's in my view, the best time to do that, the best thing to do is either subsurface band that phosphorus so that you have very low potential for runoff if there is a lot of runoff because of rain. And the second option is if you're going to broadcast the fertilizer is to try to apply that looking at the forecast and seeing that there will not be a lot of rain in the forecast so that you minimize that potential for runoff. So to wrap all of this up, we find that the deep placement of phosphorus in fields that are very flat could meet both the agronomic and the environmental goals and of maintaining grain yield and minimizing the phosphorus runoff. As we saw in the presentation, phosphorus loss increases with rate. So the more we apply, the more potential for runoff. This is for the broadcast treatments, but we saw that with a band application, you can actually put a build-up rate without worrying too much about that potential for runoff. And so in terms of the fertilizer amount, I think it's very important to, again, try to look at the recommendations and apply what you need agronomically for the crop, because even if you're doing a broadcast application, agronomically, you are not going to get an additional yield increase if you have added more, then you are getting a return on the investment on that additional phosphorus, and you are running the risk of environmental pollution. And then under typical conditions, I would suggest that fall applications be done, or phosphorus applications be done in the fall rather than the spring. And I would suggest that the subsurface band would be a better option than a broadcast application. With that, I just want to take a moment because this is, again, a very large project. Many people helped in this project. We got funding from many sources, but especially the NREC, Illinois NREC. I work with the Champaign County Soil Water Conservation District. We had also a lot of collaboration from farmers. I really am thankful to the farmers that helped us with the project. There were many students. There were 3 graduate students that got their degrees out of this project, a postdoc, and then we had Dan Schaefer that has been a great supporter of this project, my technician, Kristen Greer, that did a lot of the work, and army of undergraduate students that helped with this project. So with that, I just also posted in here a number of publications that came out of these projects. They're all available in the review literature. I have copies if you're interested, and the one that I mostly talked about today is this number 2, which talks about the phosphorus runoff study that I presented. So with that, thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Fernandez. At this time, I'll turn it over to Dr. Nelson for his presentation.
Thank you very much. Appreciate this opportunity to present. Let me get the presentation posted here. There it is. Okay, so like I said, and actually Heidi and Fabian have done an excellent job kind of giving an introduction to some of the things that I'll be talking about. So I greatly appreciate their comments and so forth. I'll be talking about water quality impacts of cover crops and phosphorus fertilizer management systems from a project that we've been conducting over the past 5 or 6 years. And before I get into the presentation, I want to go ahead and thank or acknowledge and talk about the entire team here. It's a pretty big project that I'll be presenting data from, and just couldn't fit everybody's name on the first slide there. So there's a number of faculty, Peter Tomlinson, Craig Rosenboom, Gerard Klutenberg, Deanne Presley, Jeff Williams, that have all done a lot of work on this project. I want to particularly mention the graduate students that have worked on this project. David Abel and Elliot Carver collected most of the data that I'll be presenting today, and then Cassandra Schnarr as a research assistant that also helped quite a bit on the data collection. So, and then a lot of other people that are mentioned. So appreciate all their help. And so phosphorus loss obviously can cause problems in water quality and algal blooms. I will say that about 15 years ago, even though phosphorus loss was, we talked about as an important issue, it really wasn't that important here in the state of Kansas. From the Kansas Department of Health and Environment, they weren't that concerned about it because it hadn't caused any health problems. Then we had blue-green algae blooms and some toxic blooms, and they've been going throughout our state here. And throughout the entire state, we've had occurrences of this. I don't have this data for Illinois, but I'm sure Illinois has got some similar issues. I did notice they've got, even this summer, they had some blue-green algae blooms along the Illinois River. Other states are in similar boats where I know for us, it brought the phosphorus issue a lot closer home to these producers. Phosphorus is definitely an issue in the Gulf of Mexico, but sometimes it can be difficult for a farmer in Kansas or Illinois or somewhere in the Midwest to be thinking about the Gulf of Mexico on a daily basis. But we started getting a fair number of questions from some of our producers that were concerned about these issues. It was easier for them to broadcast their fertilizer in the fall, just less expensive, labor savings, time savings, a lot of different things there. That was a preferred way of application for many producers. And as Fabian just mentioned, from a timing standpoint, this is probably the best time for us to apply or to broadcast fertilizers. But from a placement standpoint, we know that subsurface placement would be a little bit better. And they said, well, are there best management practices? And people kept bringing up cover crops. And we looked around and we thought, there's some evidence that cover crops reduce erosion, they reduce runoff. Can they reduce phosphorus loss? And we couldn't find many studies that discuss this, particularly in no-till systems. And so there were a lot of claims about what cover crops could do relative to phosphorus loss, and we couldn't find the data. And so we thought, well, let's go out and see what we can do as far as answering some of these questions. So here's a list of the questions that we kind of set out to answer. This was back in about 2014. And first, how does fertilizer placement affect PLOS when it's done at the right time? A lot of our studies comparing placement were all done in the spring. So it's a spring broadcast versus a spring injection. We said, well, what about if we do a fall broadcast? Will cover crops reduce phosphorus loss in no-till? There was some evidence, good evidence that they would work well in conventional till, but what about no-till systems? And then will cover crops particularly reduce phosphorus loss from a surface broadcast fertilizer application, right? Wanted to look at how these things might change throughout the cropping cycle, some impacts on soil health and economics and crop yield, of course. I'm going to be talking about these first questions related to phosphorus loss. So in order to answer this, we set up a study. This was about a 30-acre field with a parallel terrace system. You can kind of see the terraces in this aerial photograph. And along those terraces, we divided the field up into 18 experimental units. These are all about 1.2 acres in size, and they all drained to their own unique outlet. And so each one of these red triangles would indicate the outlet of these little small watersheds. So they're edge of field monitoring on experimental units about 1.2 acres in size. Here's a image looking up the slope at this study, and you can see some of the field plots in cover crop and some that are not, and you can see some of the equipment that we've used to measure runoff losses. We really wanted to do this all year round because we recognize that that cover crops go through different growth phases as well as our normal crops, and that all interacts with the rainfall and the precipitation that are occurring. And so we thought it's pretty important to try and do this at a field scale. I'm going to present data from 2016, 2017, 2018, and 2019, right? 4 years, it's in a no-till corn soybean rotation. So we got soybean, corn, soybean, and then corn in 2019. We had 3 phosphorus treatments, either a 0, no phosphorus application, 55 pounds of P2O5 per acre. It's fall broadcast, and then that same rate either at a 2x2 placement at planting. So, and then those 3 fertilizer treatments were all represented either with a cover crop or without a cover crop. And our cover crops varied a little bit throughout the study. A small grain with sometimes rapeseed. I'll say that the small grain is really what won out as far as growth, and that's what held on through the winter and came back next spring and gave us the cover that you would see here in the photograph. So at each of the outlets, we have equipment there to measure runoff. I won't go through the details of this equipment. If you have questions, you can ask them. And then we have samplers and equipment to collect samples. They were flow-weighted composite samples. So for every runoff event, we'd get 1 sample from each one of the, or hopefully from each one, but from each one of these experimental units, right? We'd measure that for sediment, total phosphorus, and dissolved phosphorus concentrations. So that's what I'll be talking about today. And before I get into any of those results, it's really important to talk about precipitation. I'm going to present the results kind of by year. And so I'm going to start out with these precipitation results by year. And you'll see that our average annual precipitation in this area is about 35 inches a year. And we had 2 years well below that and 2 years above that. So on average, our 4 years represent about the average, but we have extremes. We have an extremely droughty year in 2018, followed by a very, very wet year in 2019. And what's interesting in the graph here to the left, you can see that between about May 1st and June 1st, or July 1st, that's a pretty critical time period where we get most of our runoff. It's where the soils are susceptible to erosion, the crops may not have canopied out completely, and so forth. And in 2019, we started out somewhere close to average, but then ended about 8 inches above average precipitation by the end of that 2-month period. So we almost doubled in that time period, almost doubled our normal precipitation. So we had a lot of rainfall, and you'll see that in the data with a lot of runoff during that time period. So I'm going to start off talking about runoff, and this figure here is showing a comparison between the runoff volume and for no cover and the cover crop plots by event through 2018. Just not enough space to stick all of 2019 on here. But through those first 3 years, the letters atop the bars indicate significant difference within an event. And so you can see that there were several events where we significantly decreased runoff with the cover crop, but there are also several events where we increased runoff, okay? And there are times of the year where that cover crop will dry out the soil a little bit more, but then there are other times of the year where the cover crop reduces evaporation and you can maintain wetter soils and end up with higher runoff. And so that's what we see here. It really depends upon the precipitation pattern in the given year, what's going to happen. And so in general, for these 3 years, we did not have any impact on annual runoff loss. If cumulative runoff loss in those 3 years, we didn't have any impact. However, if we look at the runoff, the way that the runoff comes off, if we look at the effects on peak runoff, the peak runoff tended to be lower. And if you look at most of the figures, even where there's not a significant difference, the trend kind of holds true where the runoff, the peak runoff from the cover crop plots tends to be lower than the runoff from the non-cover plots. Only one case was the reverse found. And then if we look at runoff duration, so the time that the runoff is out there in the field, pretty consistently we have increased duration. So the runoff, it takes longer for the runoff to leave the field. Only one case was different, and this was an extreme case where there was just very, very little runoff off of the cover crop plots because it was in the middle of a drought year. So in general, we had no effect on annual runoff volume except for in 2019. There, under these conditions of pretty high, heavy rainfall, we did have lower runoff from the cover crop annually. What we saw most commonly across the entire 4-year period was that we would decrease the intensity of the runoff. And that's pretty important. So we would have a lower peak and then a longer duration of runoff. That decreased intensity decreased erosion significantly. I'll tell you that when we started this project, I had expected that we might not see a real big decrease in erosion because I thought we were doing really well controlling erosion with no-till. However, we consistently decreased erosion. Even in our lowest years of erosion, we still decreased it about 60 to 70% with cover crops. So they did an excellent job at decreasing erosion. Now, generally, you would think that we would also decrease the phosphorus concentration because we decreased the amount of sediment so much. And sediment, phosphorus tends to bind pretty tightly with our sediment. So if we decrease sediment, we would expect to decrease phosphorus, but that's not what we found. So in 2016 and 2017, there was no effect on the total phosphorus concentration in the runoff of cover crops. In 2018, we actually increased the concentration of phosphorus in the runoff. Note that was the very, very dry year. And then in a very, very wet year, 2019, we did decrease the total phosphorus concentration in the runoff. So why did we see this? Well, if we look at dissolved phosphorus concentrations, we see that we consistently increased the dissolved phosphorus concentration in the runoff. And there could be a variety of reasons for this. And we've looked at some of these. Cover crop tissue can be a source of phosphorus in the runoff water, and phosphorus can leach out of that cover crop tissue shortly after termination. And we also found that increased duration of runoff, right? So there's potential for higher contact time between the runoff and the soil, perhaps allowing the soil to release more phosphorus, come closer to equilibrium than you might expect in some other, without that cover crop, right? So a few different mechanisms that could be at play there, increasing the dissolved phosphorus concentration in the runoff. And in that dry year, that increase in dissolved phosphorus concentration was enough to increase the total phosphorus concentration. Now, if we convert these to loads, look at the loss over time, we see that, again, pretty consistently, those first 3 years, we see an increase in dissolved phosphorus loss, the total amount. In 2019, it's about equal, right? So even though we increased the concentration, remember in 2019, we decreased the total runoff, so came out about equal on the amount of total or dissolved phosphorus loss. If we look at total phosphorus loss across the study, no effect in 2 years, an increase in total phosphorus in 2018 in that dry year, and then a decrease in total phosphorus in that real wet year in 2019, where we had a lot of erosion. And so this is where we would expect that cover crop to really have an impact on phosphorus loss, and indeed it did when we had that happen. Now, so there are some inconsistent effects on annual of cover crop on annual phosphorus loss. Now let's switch gears a little bit to fertilizer management. Here we see the fertilizer management effects on the concentration of dissolved phosphorus and total phosphorus in the runoff. And in pretty consistently throughout the years, let me explain the figure. We've got control, which is gray, the orange here, which is the fall broadcast, and blue is the spring injected, right? Pretty consistently throughout the time, we see that we have higher concentrations of dissolved phosphorus where we've broadcast that phosphorus in the fall. And these are flow-weighted mean concentrations, so it's there are definitely periods of the year where we have higher concentrations because we've added that fertilizer in the fall, and then in the spring there's more fertilizer in the soil on those plots to give us higher concentration of phosphorus in the runoff. And that tends to translate over to higher total phosphorus concentrations as well. Most of the impact of fertilizer management we found was on the dissolved phosphorus. And so that's where, by decreasing the dissolved phosphorus concentrations, that decrease also translated into a decrease in total phosphorus concentration in the soil. For most years, the last year, we didn't see a significant difference in there. Now, if we look at the load, in 3 out of the 4 years, we see that spring injected phosphorus application decreased our dissolved phosphorus load by about 33%. In 2018, that was the very dry year. In that year, we actually didn't have any runoff from October. We had runoff in October, and then the next runoff we had was in August. And so we went basically the whole cropping cycle without substantial runoff. And so that would explain why there really wasn't a whole lot of a difference between the fall broadcast and spring injected. But when we get into 2019, we see again that spring injected application decreased the dissolved reactive phosphorus. When we look at total phosphorus losses, it's about a 16% decrease because we're not decreasing any of the sediment-bound phosphorus loss. It's mainly decreasing the dissolved phosphorus loss. And we see a significant decrease in 2 out of the 4 years. In 2018, in 2019, there's no difference in total phosphorus loss. So before I end, I will say that we did see some interaction. Often we saw the same effects of fertilizer placement, whether we had a cover crop or not, or we'd see the same effect of cover crops regardless of what fertilizer management we were looking at, except for dissolved reactive phosphorus concentration. And so this figure shows that in 3 of the 4 years, we actually saw an interaction, and the interaction is best described by looking at the control, the effect of cover crop on the control. And so you'll see that this figure here shows the brown bars are the no cover crop plots, the green bars are the cover crop plots, and then they're organized control, fall broadcast, spring injected. And so the letters are significant differences within year. And so we can compare like the dissolved phosphorus concentration from the control without cover crop to that with cover crop, and there's no difference there. Whereas if we compare the dissolved phosphorus concentration in runoff from the fall broadcast treatment without a cover crop, we see that adding that with the cover crop, we have a significant increase. Same thing with the spring injected. We have a significant increase there. And so the control, we see that in a phosphorus limited system, we don't necessarily see the same increase in dissolved phosphorus concentration as we might when we're applying fertilizer. There was one, so that's a summary of what we see there for our interaction there. Let me give a summary of the entire project here. Cover crops decreased our runoff intensity. They decreased sediment and particulate phosphorus losses. We did see an increase in dissolved phosphorus concentration and loss when we used a cover crop, and a variable effect on total phosphorus loss in the study. Subsurface phosphorus placement consistently decreased the dissolved phosphorus concentration in runoff. We decreased dissolved phosphorus loss in 3 out of 4 years. We decreased total phosphorus loss in 2 of the 4 years. And there was overall, if we added up over the whole year, over the whole 4 years, we saw a decrease in total phosphorus loss with that subsurface placement. So in general, you know, where would I recommend we go with this? Well, cover crops are a great tool to reduce our sediment loss. They're going to do a really good job of reducing phosphorus loss if we're in a system with high sediment loss, right? In conventional till systems, in soils that are highly sloping, highly erodible, systems that you would expect a lot of sediment loss, the cover crops will likely decrease phosphorus loss in those systems too. But in systems where where we're controlling sediment loss with other mechanisms, or maybe the more level landscape where we don't have so much sediment loss, then those cover crops might increase our dissolved phosphorus losses. And that's where the variable effect on total phosphorus comes in, either no effect or potentially an increase. We would recommend, I'd recommend strongly that people look at managing their fertilizer in their phosphorus fertilizer to limit phosphorus loss in cover crop systems, right? So subsurface application, keeping your soils at or near that critical level, not building them up beyond what is needed for crop production. So finally, I want to thank our funding sources. We had a lot of good funding from the 4R Research Fund. The fertilizer industry has been very good to support us in this. Funding also came from the Kansas Soybean Commission, Kansas Corn Commission. NRCS has done an excellent job in funding. We greatly appreciate their contribution to the project, as well as Kansas State University and NIFA. with that, I guess that concludes my presentation, and I think brings us to about where we can do our chat, our panel discussion.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Nelson, for your presentation. At this time, I'm going to turn things over to my colleague, Jean Brokish. She is American Farmland Trust Program Manager and located here in Illinois. Jean, I will turn it over to you for some of the Q&A.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, some really good questions there. I think, Dr. Nelson, I'm going to just start off with you. There was a really great question that was posted during your presentation about what is the slope of the field that you have in your research study?
Yeah, the slope there is about 5 to 7%. It's a Smolin silt loam. It's a soil that has a heavy argillic horizon, somewhere between 36 and 39% clay, starting at about 8 to 12 inches deep. And so it's a soil that would have high runoff, okay?
So, yeah, so that's a really good kind of setup for the next question of like, how would you expect, or would you expect to see the same results on a different soil? Maybe if it's flatter or a different textured soil?
Sure, I can only guess what it might be. I would expect potentially different results. Particularly, it's pretty hard when you have a heavy argillic horizon like these soils have to affect the deep infiltration, right? So cover crops, we've seen an increase in aggregate stability in the surface horizons, and that would typically increase infiltration. However, when you have a heavy argillic horizon right below that, then the deep percolation is not affected by these cover crops, or at least has not yet been affected in these soils. A different soil with different soil properties, different textures, where cover crops might change the hydrology a little bit differently, then you can see different results for sure.
Okay, and there's some other kind of soil health questions coming up. I just want to maybe hold that a thought, because I did have one other question was posed along that lines on your study, but maybe just kind of stepping back, and some of the very first questions that were posed, and I think they're just really good fundamental questions on soil testing. One was, the frequency. Generally, I think the recommended practices, or, you don't need to test your soil every year. But the question comes, is it actually better to test every year? Because then you can make more accurate decisions in terms of phosphorus. So I just wondered, as agronomists and researchers, if there was any thoughts on that.
I can talk a little bit about that. So there is nothing wrong in doing soil sampling every year. It's just kind of a question of what can be done and what should be done, and the cost, and it's kind of a diminishing returns kind of thing, right? Typically, if you take soil samples every 3 or 4 years, you will be able to manage the applications very well. Having more data points every year, it doesn't hurt, but it's just additional cost that doesn't really necessarily improve your ability to manage the nutrients better. And then the other thing that I always like to kind of illustrate to farmers is, when you're driving down the field planting, if you want to make a straight road, you don't look at the front tire of the tractor. You look, at the end of the field or something. And sometimes when we look at soil test values, people tend to focus a lot, especially if they have yearly data, to look at that year specifically. And there is a lot of variability in that data. And so it's always better to have data points, but kind of look at the long-term relationship. Are the test values going up, staying the same, going down, to manage the nutrients? So I would say every 3 to 4 years is a good time to soil test. If you have a cropping system that takes a lot of nutrient out of the field, like, I don't know, you're cutting alfalfa and you have a very intense system like that, maybe every other year or something like that would be a better approach. But for most of the corn and soybean cropping systems that we have in the Midwest, I think every 4 years is adequate.
I'd like to add to that. Fabian, I liked your example of looking out in front, you know, and looking at the data over time and how that changes, because I think that is really important for phosphorus management. And you know, if you were to make some drastic change in management on your field, or let's say that you soil test and you see something that needs to be addressed immediately, and so you spend that year really working on that, like changing the pH, whatever the case may be, that in that situation, then there may be a need to increase the frequency so that you can understand that relationship between the changes you're making and the resulting soil test phosphorus level. But otherwise, yeah, I agree with everything Fabian said.
Great. The other question related to soil testing, especially in terms of the recommendation to band it, how does one go about soil sampling that? You know, the typical grid process may need to be adjusted, right?
Yeah, well, that's, and I don't know if Nathan or Heidi have, I'm sure that they have their thoughts too, but I just would like to mention, because this really relates directly back to some of the things that we were looking at in that project I presented today. Obviously, I didn't talk about the portion of the soil sampling, but that was one of the main questions that came up from a lot of different farmers that were doing a strip till and banding their fertilizer, and their soil test values were all over the place. And so we designed this study to look at that question. And just to be quick on my answer, basically what we found is that when you're banding the fertilizer, for every core that you take where the fertilizer band is located, you need to take at least 2 or 3 cores outside of that fertilizer band and then composite those, and then repeat that a few times so that you end up with a robust composite sample. I normally say, you know, take, you know, at least 12 cores or something like that, 10 to 12 cores, and composite into one with that ratio of 1 to 3 or 1 to 2, because that will allow you to basically figure out the total fertility of that field and not overestimate. If you're always taking samples right where the band is, you will overestimate the fertility. That will result in under application potentially. And if you take always outside of that fertilizer band, then you will underestimate the fertility and you'll be applying more than you actually need. So that's my recommendation. The other thing too is the band, how deep that band is, making sure that you quantify that in the sampling depth that you take. I mean, in Illinois, the sampling depth is 7 inches. So hopefully the fertilizer band is within that top 7 inches, and you'll be able to tap into that band. If you don't know where the band is located, then trying to do some kind of approach where you take samples in relationship with the row, but always kind of maintaining similar distance, you will have, tagging in probability, you'll basically be hitting that fertilizer band at some point in the sampling.
Because I'll just say that I agree with Fabian. He did an excellent job explaining that. The biggest thing that I mention to producers in that case is, if you're in a field where you've banded fertilizer, you just really have to pay attention to your collection methods. You need to pay attention to depth, pay attention to placement of where you're doing that, following what Fabian mentioned, and you need to pay attention to the number of samples. You need to take more cores, not less, because you're going to end up with higher variability out in that field, and your best way to compensate for that is good sampling practice and some additional cores in that composite.
Great. So I think there's kind of a group of questions that I'm just going to couch under the word trade-offs, you know, like all of these multiple decisions have to be made all the time, weighing against the weather, et cetera. So related to Heidi's presentation and emphasizing the right time, and kind of thinking spring versus fall or winter on the snow, timing of application. There was a question about, first, I guess, is the question that all the presenters actually agree that applying on snow-covered ground is a bad idea, which I think all the research and indicates that is the case. So, but maybe we could talk a little bit about, you know, Heidi, just to hear from you, like how do you respond to that? Like, it's the right time for me to be out there applying my fertilizer.
Right. Yeah, I was reading through the questions, and there's so many good ones about those trade-offs and timing and placement. And yeah, you just have to remember why are you applying the fertilizer? So that your crops can utilize it. So if you apply it on the snow, then what will happen when the spring comes and it melts? It will wash off with the snow melt. And I'm a data geek, and so before preparing my presentation, I reached out to Jean and asked about some of the local data so that I can see, look at those trends, and you really can see when the snow melt is happening, the losses are happening then as well. So so definitely I'm avoiding that application on the frozen ground and over the snow. And you know, thinking about timing versus placement and which is more important, you know, it's again, it's all a system, right? And so you have to think about, where are you farming? What are you growing? What is the slope? When, you know, all of these different factors come into play. What are the other practices that you're using on your field? Because, you know, timing might be more important for one person and placement might be more important for another, but they work hand in hand. You have to look at them together, because again, if it rains immediately after you apply your fertilizer, then timing was the most important with the placement. You know, if you make that placement so that there is that contact with the soil, so, you know, a light incorporation or injecting it into the soil, then you're going to lose less if it does rain within the next couple days.
Either of you have anything to add to that?
I would just agree with what Heidi said there, that that it's a system, and really we're not kind of stacking practices on top of each other or trading one for another. You're looking at the system that you're in, and you're going to do the best job that you can to manage nutrients in that system and build a nutrient management system, conservation system together that will accomplish that goal. And it's going to depend upon, you know, the climate of the area you're in, the soils that you're in, the cropping system you're in. All of those things are going to affect what your answer is going to be.
Yeah, I think that's so important, you know, when you look at this information that we presented today. I mean, obviously there are some kind of implicit bias without wanting to be biased, but it's really, I mean, we are presenting research specific to the conditions where we did the study, right? And so you need to look at these things and figure out, okay, how well does this apply to my specific conditions, right? I mean, for instance, strip till, where I did the study, was a flat field, flat fields. That may not be the case for a lot of the audience in, you know, Western Illinois, where you have more sloping fields. How will you do the strip till? I mean, if you do the strips in the direction of the slope, you can actually create a lot of erosion. You know, you can create a channel for water to move and not only take the phosphorus that you apply there, but also the soil. And so you have to take everything and figure out, okay, how does that work in my system? What are some of the limitations? What are some of the benefits that I have? And as Dr. Nelson mentioned too, you know, in terms of the soil, in his study, you know, he had a horizon with a lot of clay. Well, if that can change substantially if you have a soil that is more permeable below the surface. And so all those things need to be considered.
So I think that everybody would agree, you know, the right amount is important. And it actually gave me kind of chills harkening back to my grad student days where I actually did some phosphorus work, and the findings of my study at that point was the more phosphorus you have, the more that runs off. You know, the more you put on, the more that comes out, basically. So right time or right amount is critical. But if there was kind of a way to tease out which is more important, is it more the timing then, or is it more the placement of it, you know, in terms of effects from a runoff or water quality? Looking at that, the effects on water quality. Are there thoughts of that? Is there a clear decision there, or if it is site specific, what conditions in the site would help determine that?
Well, I guess I will start with that. I think the placement is very important. I mean, the data I showed today, I think pretty clearly shows that you can apply a very high phosphorus rate, and if you subsurface band it, it will be protected from runoff. And so if you're in a situation where maybe you have to build up your soil test values, that may be a practice that you may want to do instead of broadcasting it. And so because the rate, you know, what rate you apply, it's, again, so dependent on the conditions, right? Depending on whether you're renting that land or if you own that land, what the soil test values are, what your goals are. And so that will be my suggestion in terms of the environmental quality. If you have to apply a large amount of phosphorus for whatever reason, I would suggest, you know, subsurface banding it.
And I'll add to that, you know, when we think about placement and we think about, you know, how it works in with some of the other practices that are being discussed. So like presentation on cover crops. So if we're using cover and well, we can end up seeing taking place if we're just broadcasting the fertilizer on the surface. So higher levels of phosphorus testing at the surface profile of the soil. And so that's where, especially when we're incorporating it into the soil and bringing it deeper down, you're reducing the opportunity for the loss from the erosion on the surface and also those dissolved nutrients as well.
Go ahead.
Oh yeah, I'll just mention there that the placement, I think, does a really good job of having very immediate impacts on water quality. You can, you know, if you're placing that phosphorus below the soil surface, that's going to have an impact that year. That's going to have an impact on those events right after placement. Where rate can really have an impact, you know, outside of really high rates that might come with, you know, but when you're looking at agronomic rates, selecting the right agronomic rate is going to affect soil test levels, where they're going to go in the future. Are you increasing soil test levels? Are you decreasing soil test levels? And so I really see that as driving your long-term losses. Where are you going to be in the long run? And it also affects your, you know, your agronomics and your economics and things like that. So make sure you're selecting a rate that is going to, you know, maintain your soil. It's not going to overly build your soil beyond what you need to grow your crop.
One more question kind of on similar to, you know, this varies based on site. And so the question came in about tile drainage and directed to Dr. Fernandez, and whether you felt, how many of your findings on P loss for surface runoff would be expected to be carried over to changes in phosphorus that we find in tile flow?
Yeah, that's a good question, and one that is difficult to answer without actually looking at those concentrations in a tile drain, right? I mean, with the broadcast applications, we know that we increase the concentrations on the surface. With the subsurface, we could maintain, as I show there, we could maintain the fertility as we have with the broadcast for the whole field, but placing it deeper in the profile. And so the question is then, when you have water moving through the profile, how would that impact things? And it's hard to answer because, see, with a subsurface band, you concentrate a lot of phosphorus in a very small area of the soil. And a lot of the dissolved phosphorus that you collect in tile drain has to do with macropore flow and how fast that water moves through the profile. And so if you happen to have a system where you have a lot of macropores or big pores that go right through where you apply the fertilizer in a band, you can potentially increase the amount, right, that of that dissolved phosphorus going through the tile line. But I would say, in playing with the probability that you have large pores always right in the band of fertilizer where it's a hot spot of phosphorus, it's probably less than if you have a very high phosphorus level on the surface. That obviously you have more potential for those macropores to be distributed somewhat uniformly across the field. And so again, kind of a hard question to answer, but my suspicion is that with the deep banding, you still probably are able to reduce the total dissolved phosphorus relative to a broadcast application. That would be kind of my thought. And again, all things equal, because like I show in some of those slides, the total fertility of the field, it's about the same. What changes is kind of the distribution. But I don't know what others, if others have thoughts about that.
There was a great study that was published a few years ago by Dr. Kevin King and Mark Williams, and what you explained was demonstrated in what they were able to evaluate and what they recorded in their leachate samples. And so it all went back to when you increase that fertilizer and soil contact, you're reducing the amount that can move through the soil, with the leachate. And so placement, really can reduce the losses through tile leachate. Mm-hmm.
There's a question that people have indicated they'd really like to answer. I think it is interesting. It's directed to Dr. Fernandez. Would you recommend placing your strip till bands of fertilizer in the same place every year, or offsetting them, moving them over 10 inches every year if you're on a 3-year soil test schedule?
Yeah, that's a good question. The study that I presented today, we use RTK, and we were always applying the fertilizer and planting always in the same position. Again, from an agronomic standpoint, I don't see any benefit on how you apply the fertilizer or where you apply it. Environmentally, I think it's a benefit. The big question, I guess, it becomes with the strip till, what you're also doing is creating a controlled traffic system, right? You're always driving on the same spot, so you're compacting only smaller portions of the field. And so when you move that fertilizer band, you can actually end up trying to plant crops in an area where it's compacted from previous wheel traffic. So I would not have a real good answer to that. What's better? I really don't know. My preference would be to try to distribute the fertility over the field. But again, it's one of those things that we were talking earlier with trade-offs, because if you are tilling different parts of the field, the advantage of a strip till is that it creates basically a kind of a no-till situation between the rows, where you have those macropores that allow for water to move through. And so if you're moving that strip till, you're basically breaking all of that benefit. And so I would say probably not necessarily. I would not necessarily, change where I apply the fertilizer from year to year. The other part too is that, the plants, the root system takes nutrients from the whole entire profile. And so you do get redistribution of nutrients over time.
Okay. Well, there's a whole bunch more. This is really great discussion, and I knew we were going to run short on time because there's even a question here about, the economic trade-offs, and unfortunately we're not going to get to address that today. I just want to thank Dr. Peterson, Dr. Nelson, and Dr. Fernandez for joining us today. We have a quick kind of wrap-up discussion. Sarah Blount from American Farmland Trust is going to do a short presentation on some opportunities specific to Illinois that can help advance 4Rs and phosphorus management and cropping systems. So I will invite her to turn her video on, and we can pull up her slide set and hear from her for a few minutes. You're good to go, Sarah.
Awesome. Thank you, Teresa, for pulling that up. So I'm just going to go over a few opportunities that are available here in Illinois specifically. So on the next slide, we will talk a little bit, you can go ahead and advance it, about fall covers for spring savings. So this is a program specifically designed for Illinois, offered by the Illinois Department of Ag. This is a $5 cover crop discount that will show up on your crop insurance bill. So there are no acreage caps. You can submit as many acres as you'd like, and it's entirely on a rolling first come, first served basis. However, these cover crops cannot be enrolled in any other programs. So there is no double dipping if you're already getting funding through any other type of cost share type program. On the next slide, we have our second practice called STAR, or Saving Tomorrow's Agricultural Resources. So this is just a really nice one-page form that just takes a few minutes to fill out. It gives you a ranking from 1 to 5 stars based on how you fill out the questionnaire. And this assesses one field per one crop year. So you do have to fill these out more than once if you'd like some recurring data for your field. After you fill out the form and get your STAR results, there is an option to display a sign by your field saying that you're a 4-star farmer, which is really great, or even a 5 or a 3. You can be proud of 2 if you really want. So it's really nice to show off to your neighbors that you're doing a really great job of preserving the soil. And you can see the image of the form over on the left. That's just the front, gives you an idea of what some of the questions are. Not only is this great for the state to see farmers hopefully advancing from lower stars to higher stars year to year, but it's also a really great self-assessment tool. So if you're looking for maybe something else you can add into your rotation, something small you could do, something big that you're looking forward to, this is a really great jumping off point to see where you're at and what the next option should be for you. And then the next slide. This is an AFT project sponsored through a SIG grant, Conservation Innovation Grant. And this study, we have a couple case studies already finished for Illinois, and averaging the 2 of those case studies through completing some nice soil health practices, these 2 farmers saw a $28 per acre average net income increase just through the practices that they did. So this study is really designed to help you see what new practices could do for you. Is it going to be $28 an acre? Is it going to be more? This is just a nice predictive assessment that'll provide you a 1-page info sheet or more if you're interested on some environmental and economic benefits that would occur on your own farm if you implemented practices that you're considering. It'll also show you some net income gains and losses like the $28 per acre and some return on investment calculations as well, just to see what these practices are going to do for you and if you're really going to get your money's worth out of them. So if you're interested in running this analysis, I'd like to offer it specifically for the watershed that Chris mentioned that we work in, the Upper Macoupin Creek watershed. But even if you're outside of the watershed and you have farmers or you are a farmer that are really interested in something like this, go ahead and contact me. My email is there at the bottom of the slide, or anyone else in AFT, and we will get you to the right person to help you out. And with that, I think I'm turning it back over to Chris for a closing.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah, and a big thank you to our presenters today. Also like to again thank Mosaic and the Walton Family Foundation for providing us with funding to put on this webinar. Also the Illinois Sustainable Ag Partnership and the Upper Macoupin Creek Watershed Partnership for again making this webinar possible. If anyone has any ideas for future phosphorus management topics they'd like to hear more about, please contact us. We'd love to hear from you. We'd love to do these again throughout the year. And we're always looking for ideas on what farmers and farmer advisors are wanting to know more about as it relates to phosphorus and nutrient management. If you have the CCA app on your phone and would like the CEUs, please feel free to scan that QR code at the top of the screen at this time. If you don't have the app, but you'd like to receive the credits, just place your name and CCA number in the chat box. And with that, thank you and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone.